It's my pleasure to introduce a team of 3 who have worked on this paper. Harold Fallon, who you see on the screen, but also his partners and collaborators, Benoît Vandenbulcke. And Benoît are 2 people that I know pretty well because they were there in the very beginning of my career as a professor. And I had the pleasure of teaching them and also supervising their senior theses. And in 2003, they founded a really interesting architecture office called AgwA, which has done some great work. Harold is teaching and researching at KU Leuven, so the hosts of this conference. And he's been doing that since 2007. He did a PhD. Actually, I had understood that it was between RMIT in Melbourne and also KU Leuven, no?
In fact, it's RMIT, but it was an agreement with St. Lucas at the time.
Yeah, St. Lucas, okay.
Or it was KU Leuven.
Okay.
With RMIT. Okay.
And Benoît also is an engineer, architect out of our school. And I also had the pleasure of working with him both as a student and also as an assistant. He's a co-founder of AgwA, and he did his PhD with us at Louvain, which was based on his practice and used a number of case studies to investigate some pretty prestigious architectures like Sana, Zumthor, Herzog and de Meuron. And he is currently teaching, he's been teaching since 2017 at the University of Liège. And Benoît Burquel is a little bit younger. He graduated from Liège in 2005. And he also got a master's in human settlements from KU Leuven in 2007. And he has taught at University of Liège, but now he's teaching at the Free University of Brussels. And he has organized a number of formations in real estate architecture. And he's been a partner at AgwA since 2017. Their lecture, their communication is called Distributed Artifacts Found in Translation, which is a series of plays on words, which I particularly appreciate. They have to say. Harold, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just before I start, maybe I should say also that Benoît and myself, we work together through our universities, and we have set up a research platform which is aiming mainly at the practicing architects who engage their professional practice into their research. And it's from this perspective that we have written this contribution. So, distributed artifacts found in translation. Note: the presentation consists of a series of images and a text. They form 2 autonomous, interdependent, parallel, and intersecting threads. The images punctuate the text following regular intervals. In a couple of days, our first peer-reviewed selections of articles will be published following the conference Practice in Research, which was held in May 2019. In this publication, practicing architects were asked to develop a reflection upon the nature of the interaction between their practice and their research. They were explicitly invited to make an explorative use of text and illustration, with the objective to overcome the traditional duality and hierarchy between word and images. The call imposed the use of, quote, format A4 facing pages starting with a front page maximum 11 pages. They contain a maximum of 2,000 words and are abundantly illustrated. The images are not mere illustrations of the text, but an active part of the statement. End of quote. Inversely, the text was not to be considered as a simple caption of the images. No specific template or layout was provided. The contributors to the Practices in Research issue number 1 all provided sophisticated layouts. Fonts and styles, images and compositions resulted from specific and refined choices. Eventually, following a double-blind peer review process, the 4 selected contributions were adapted following a template developed by the graphic designers Orphée Grandhomme and Ismaël Benani. The template is a simple structure containing differentiated levels for images and text. The authors were free to use these templates as they wished and needed. There were no specific instructions or guidelines regarding the appropriation of the layout. Still, the contributions had to be translated from one layout into another one. As a consequence, this translation was considered with care. A striking example is the contribution of Johannes Berry. In the original layout, each page is subdivided in several rectangular zones, some of them again subdivided. These zones are identified by specific fonts or image types and repeated over different spreads. The content is thus distributed over different receptacles that are virtually interchangeable. It becomes possible to read a text in conjunction with neighboring or distant images and text fragments. Using the template, this principle is somehow softened by the new layout. Pages cannot be forced into spreads, and there are limitations on the images and fonts, for example. However, the rules provided by the template are used in order to provide a fitting and similar way of distributing the contents. Is the layout also part of the content of the contribution? And if so, does the relayouting of the final publication alter the sense of the contributions? Or is the layout a simple way of combining documents which bear a stable intrinsic significance independently of the support? Does a support considered as a medium bear itself a significance that precedes its content? First, maybe, do images contain an intrinsic signification? Since the late 80s, image science has widely developed, but, quote, a general science of image has not yet been established, end of quote. There is an ongoing debate against the excessive semiotization of forms of visual expressions. Images, potentially extended to other non-verbal forms, seem to delineate a cognitive field which is not completely covered by semantics. Serge Tisseron pointed out that it is not true that images are assimilated through text and speech only. Images are also assimilated by relating them to other images and through actions like reproduction, inspiration, reaction, etc. This principle of assimilation means that images do not bear the signification or produce their effects in themselves, but rather through the relationships that they enable with other texts, images, and actions. The interrelations of text, image, and action is of particular importance when considering research in architecture, a discipline in which images play an essential role as mediating artifacts, and where action is central, both as a means in the unfolding of a design process and as an objective, the realization of a piece of reality which does not yet exist yet. In architecture practice and in practice-based research, these interrelations simply happen in a way. A scale model is related to a descriptive text containing images. Sketches are pinned on the wall and commented. Emails are exchanged containing screenshots. Architectural practice and practice-based research in architecture, therefore, should investigate how these relationships are formalized in a conscious and effective way. This is probably why the contributors to the Practices in Research publication all developed complex and visibly meaningful layouts to support their contributions, being left free to do so. In his library, David Vanderburgh develops a sustained attention to the special disposition of the books and works according to what he calls the law of the good neighbor. The idea is that questions and hypotheses can emerge through the relative position of the books. The library of the Sitterwerk Foundation in St. Gallen uses this principle in a different way. The library provokes proximities between books by asking the readers to put them back in another place after reading. George D.D. Huberman curated an exhibition at the Reina Sofia Museum in 2010 exploring the principle of the atlas. For him, the term atlas refers more generally to books and works in which, quote, images are gathered in a systematic, problematic, poetic, and sometimes erratic way to be offered to our eyes, end of quote. An intention is essential in the making of an atlas. This expanded notion of an atlas is not only about displaying existing knowledge, but also about provoking new considerations, understandings, and fields of relevance. The value of a formal organization of contents, such as an atlas, lies also in its operationality. This is the capacity to trigger action or further developments. It is no coincidence that David Vanderburgh's atlas, which contains a series of compositions of assembled pictures, was given the name of the Mnemosyne. A primordial titanid in ancient Greece, the daughter of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth, she is the personification of memory and remembrance, which is retrospective. But she is also the mother of the muses, the inspiration of artists and creative minds, which is prospective. When research involves an artistic or architectural practice, verbal accounts, images, objects, and actions interrelate in multiple ways. The nature of these interrelations play a central role in the ever-growing amount of loosely framed and overlapping research models and methodologies, such as research by design, research through design practice, project-grounded research, practice-based research, artistic research, and so on. To understand these models, the mutual position of the practice, or the artifacts produced in the framework of the practice, and of the reflection, mainly the text produced in the framework of the reflection, is pivotal. If they are to be fully engaged according to their nature, different types of content are not necessarily organized following a hierarchical pattern. On the contrary, specialization is essential in order to facilitate the mutual relationships in which their effectiveness is rooted. For architects relating their practice to research, the creation of special settings is exactly what their practice as architects is about. As such, they rapidly become integrated in the design strategies of the practice. The practice is not the research itself, but the output of the research may in this way become part of the practice again. The research output integrates the oeuvre. It is simultaneously a reflection about the work and a part of the work. As such, it becomes the subject of further action, reflection, and research. We argue that it is even a condition of the effectiveness of the research. Two examples amongst others. For the defense of his PhD in 2012, Arno Hendricks modified the space of his presentation by building a tribune and creating staircases. The presentation of the research became an item of the research and an item of the practice at the same time. During the CARE conference in Ghent in 2019, Thomas Holmes read a text, showed a scale model, and played the piano, including own compositions. In doing so, he activated explicitly a network of relationships between image, word, and action. The performance also enacted the interrelations of his manifold practice, including architecture, teaching, composing, researching. In a different way, The book SMLXL presents a series of works, references, and reflections of the Office OMA in a form that corresponds to the notions of complexity, simultaneity, juxtaposition, transposition, and so on. These notions underpin also the architectural practice of the Office. The output, the book, is not only a reflection about the practice, but it is also a reflection of the practice. To recapitulate, the form of these outputs, exhibitions, performances, publications, installations, resonate with their content. They integrate them in the practice while staying in the realm of research. The effect is that their operationality towards further practice and research is multiplied. They are multimodal, distributed, non-hierarchical realizations which represent a reality or hypothesis rooted in practice, in a retrospective or prospective way. The validity of this kind of output thus implies the validity of the content and of the form it takes. Form, then, is not a cosmetic or ornamental feature, it becomes an essential feature of the output. We will further refer to this type of output containing multiple content types and modalities, and in which the verbal is not necessarily dominant, as distributed artifacts. Artifact refers to the coherence and intentionality of a formally identifiable whole. Distributed refers to its composed nature, sub-artifacts, and to the spatial disposition thereof. It refers to an intentional and internal interpretation of Gell's distributed object and can be related to Latour's hairy object, objet chevelu. Distributed artifacts are significant items which cannot be reduced to their verbal content. In research, this means that distributed artifacts go beyond the typical duality and distance between research and practice. The strength of the Mnemosyne Atlas resides maybe in the fact that the form and content reflects also the vision of Aby Warburg on art history. The Atlas resonates with its library, and it is also part of the same library. The conjunction of form and content opens the doors to further developments, interpretations, and actions. The mutual appropriateness of form and content of distributed artifacts cannot be circumscribed to the verbal and the quantifiable, as they contain significant non-verbal material. Referring to Ranulph Glanville, it may be rather an issue of being good enough, instead of being right or wrong. It would therefore not be consistent to assess the appropriateness of these artifacts exclusively through verbal or quantifiable lenses. Distributed artifacts require a combination of verbal logical assessment and of intersubjective appreciation to address the layeredness of their inductive, deductive, operational, and formal aspects. And I apologize for my pronunciation.
Thank you, Harold. I propose that everybody opens their microphones and a bit of applause. You're perfectly within the timing, so that's very good. I think it may be of interest to go right ahead to the next presentation, and we can save the questions for the end if that's all right with everybody. Is that okay with the organizers, Caroline, Irene?
Definitely is. Yeah, we could. Sepideh?
Sepideh. So is Sepideh here? Hello, Sepideh.
She is. We're bringing her in.
Okay, good. Sepideh, Karami is an architect, writer, researcher, and teacher. This is something that I pulled off of Google, so I hope it's accurate. She has a PhD from KTH, School of Architecture, in architecture and critical studies. Her thesis was called Interruption, Writing a Dissident Architecture through Writing Practices and Critical Fiction Understood as Political Practices of Making Architectural Spaces. So we are quite solidly in the domain of tools and how those tools can influence and affect architectural production. She's been committed to teaching, practice, and research in various contexts, and is currently at the Edinburgh School of Architecture as a postdoc, working on decolonizing infrastructures. Is that correct, Sepideh?
Yes, very correct. Thank you.
Okay, and I pass you the floor.
Sure.
Share your screen.
Does it work now?
I can see your screen, but you have to put yourself on full screen.
All right. Just a moment. How about now?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm very honored to be here and to have a chance to share part of my research that is a work in progress, and it's in its very beginning. So the following presentation is about the case study of Technical Institute of Abaddon in southwest Iran. It is an educational institution connected to oil industry and the field of petroleum, and was built in the midst of colonization of oil resources by the British Petroleum Company. And it was designed by the architect of British Empire, James Mollison Wilson, in 1939. The story of the Technical Institute in this presentation comes in two parts. The first part is about how material practices become effective instrument of colonization. And the second part is about how we can read or listen to a piece of architecture that has come to existence in the focal point of all those destructive forces of colonization, and how a colonial building can ultimately become a decolonizing infrastructure. Just to contextualize a bit, Abaddon, where in the building is located, is a city developed an oil economy following the discovery of oil in 1908. Although not that much spoken about, but the city and its oil has played an important role in British history and in Britain's standard of living from the 1920s into the 1940s, facilitating the move from coal consumption to oil. As Stephen Kinzer writes, British cars, trucks, and buses run on cheap Iranian oil. Factories throughout Britain were fueled by oil from Iran. The Royal Navy, which projected British power all over the world, powered its ships with Iranian oil. So it's very understandable why Winston Churchill once called the Iranian oil a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dream. Well, the prize for Churchill, though, was a curse for Iranians. It brought the country under colonization for more than 40 years by British Petroleum, what was then called Anglo-Persian or Anglo-Iranian oil company. Furthermore, after nationalization of oil resources, or oil industry by Iranian Prime Minister at the time, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1951, and the dismissal of British Petroleum soon after, MI6 and CIA choreographed the coup d'etat in 1953 to remove Mossadegh from the political scene and to regain access to oil. A coup that brought an end to the project of democracy in the Iranian context and in the Middle East, a tragedy that, and a mess that we are still experiencing it. So Technical Institute building is situated in such a mess. The building is an important case, not only as a historical building per se, but also as an evidence of how white geology, exploitation of natural resources, and colonization can change the course of history of a region and the life of its people forever. So when the British Petroleum formed Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1909 with extremely unfair conditions, most of the workers in the company were either brought along from other colonies or they were British technical staff. And Iranians were not even considered as local workforces, and they were mostly employed as servants. And such manning approach by the company was obviously a way to guarantee the monopoly over oil resources and oil industry, and to avoid any risk of letting go of that monopoly. However, during years of negotiations, movements, resistance, there was more and more pressure on the company to employ local workers, as well as creating chances for Iranians to gain technical skills. And the Abaddon Technical Institute was initially built to respond to that matter, to give Iranian apprentices basic technical skills. But as Katayoun Shafi'i writes in her book, Machineries of Oil, an Infrastructural History of BP in Iran, 7 years later, in 1945, only 1,700 Iranians had received training. So as a strategy, the company sought to minimize the number of Iranians being sent to training, to university training, and maximize the number in trade training. So in this way, Technical Institute as an institution in the context of colonization becomes an interesting case, as it played a role in who could have access to knowledge, to what kind of knowledge, and to what extent. While knowledge ownership was used as a means of power to retain control over natural resources and the benefits thereof, architecture as a material institution also supported such dependency through material intervention. Such dependency was visible in general in James Mollison Wilson's work, not only in terms of architectural style and models of urban planning and urban design, but also in the building material. For example, in this picture, we see another work by Wilson, which is called Taj Cinema, also in Abaddon, the same city. And as you see, the London red brick that was used in construction of the building was imported from England, all the way from England to Abaddon as ballast. So it was a way of injecting foreign material in a place as a symbolic way of appropriation. Michel Serres, in his Appropriation Through Pollution, writes about how polluting and leaving traces in a place enforces appropriation. His examples to support his argument varies from a wedding ring marking ownership over the other's body, to how animals territorialize by urinating and leaving traces. So architecture is one of the most powerful material practices, assists colonization and process of appropriation in a similar manner. The dependency on a foreign source and symbolic appropriation by means of material intervention is also present in Abaddon Technical Institute. What is interesting in this building is that beside the imported building material, there are two more animate elements in the building: a clock and 3 bells located on top of the building that are manufactured and made by Gillett and Johnson, bell and clock manufacturing in Croydon, Surrey in England, and then imported to Abaddon to be installed in the building. The bells used to be heard over the city of Abaddon on the first day of every academic year to welcome the new students. The chimes that continued even after the the nationalization of oil and the dismissal of British Petroleum Company in 1951 stopped after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, perhaps as an anti-colonial gesture. But while the bells are dormant, the clock is still working, and it's still a very present monument of colonization in Abaddon. And the clock on the tower is connected to several clocks within the institution and inside the building. And what is interesting here is that appropriation has happened, as I said, not only through inanimate building material, excuse me, but through controlling time and rhythm of not only the building, but also the town. So in the context of colonization, architecture has always been a powerful instrument to represent the colonial power and to mark the land. Stories of colonization are inscribed in the building material and in the structure. But for the project of decolonization, we should also ask how we can make building tell those silenced and subjugated stories. Excuse me. To do so with Technical Institute, I have applied two methods of watching the photographs borrowed from Ariella Azoulay, combined with methods of storytelling. Azoulay writes in the civil contract of photography, one needs to stop looking at the photograph and instead start watching it. The verb to watch is usually used for regarding phenomena or moving pictures. It entails dimensions of time and movement that need to be reinscribed in the interpretation of the still photographic image. Following Azoulay, the act of watching opens up an image to new meanings and histories, to extract potential and to reconstruct not the event that the photograph bears, but the political ground that it suggests. By watching a photograph, one creates a storyboard that many of its frames are missing. They're missing in the colonial narratives and the grand narratives of the states. Those undocumented, disconnected, disappeared, or silenced frames could be found, exposed, imagined, or reconstructed by the act of watching. By watching a photograph, one opens up spaces for other stories to be told, for other voices to be heard. So in the left minutes of my presentation, I would like to spend some time to invite you to an experiment of a storytelling combined with the act of watching the photograph that is a work in progress. And I'm going to only share a piece of it to expose how I am working with this method. The story starts from a photograph of the war-torn Technical Institute, as you see, and the moment when the piece of architecture leaves its perfect frame and becomes very vulnerable. So I read a part of it. Beheaded palm trees, half burnt, cast their shadows over the building and the site. The orange shade stretches itself over the bricks and the dusted and broken windows. The lower windows are cushioned by sandbags, piled on top of the wooden planks, each supported by 2 empty oil barrels, a structure that is supposed to protect the fragile building material against the blast waves. The arches and brickworks, once designed and drawn by the architect of British Empire, James Mollison Wilson, in 1939, is partially destroyed. Walls are hollowed and destructed by the bombs and rockets. Wilson's commitment to symmetry is overthrown by the asymmetrical mechanism of war. The breakage in the upper windows with dark, irregular shapes reveal the emptiness of an interior that is itself left in a mess upon evacuation in the onset of war between Iran and Iraq in 1980, and later covered with the dust of frequent blasts finding their ways in by smashing the windows. Tired soldiers should have passed by this building. They should have leaned to its walls, lit cigarettes, and have played with pebbles on the ground with the tip of their boots. They have exhaled the smoke up to the air and watched it disperse against the sunset. They might have remembered the chime of the bells when the Technical Institute was still in operation. They might have imitated the chime in their heads and have rhymed it with punch of bombs and the barrages. Tired soldiers might have lifted the sling of their rifles off their shoulders and have felt a momentary relief from the weight of war. One tired soldier might have stepped into the building on a more silent war day to escape the burning heat of the southern sun. His steps might have echoed in empty corridors punctuated with pieces of glass, stones, smashed bricks, pencils, stuff. The tired soldier might have opened the door to that famous small lecture hall that was called Churchill's room among petroleum students. While blowing the dust off the desk in front of him and looking through the obscured view of the lecture hall, he recalled the photos of Churchill's war room in London Underground. The tired soldier might have looked around at the mess and murmured, "This is the English job." He might have laughed at his own thought. The tired soldier, like most other Iranians and those familiar with a long history of political relationship between Iran and Britain, knows that this phrase, "This is the English job," it has turned into an ironic saying that suggests whenever there is an unexplained malfunction or sabotage somewhere, there would be very probably an Englishman behind the scene. The saying has even become the title of one of Jack Straw's books that explains why Iran distrusts Britain. Such conspiracy theory, though, has gone beyond the political realm and into the realm of everyday life. So if a pipe breaks in your bathroom, you might very probably say, "Oh, this is the English job." The phrase is originated from one of the most popular Iranian TV series during the 70s called My Uncle Napoleon, based on a comic novel written by Iraj Pezeshkzad with the same title. The story happens in a garden in Tehran with different houses inhabited by different families. The community is dominated by the protagonist, Uncle Napoleon, who is a paranoid patriarch who believes foreign countries, and specifically Britain, is responsible for unfortunate events happening in Iran. Such social satire, though, is not only a paranoia, and the tired soldier knows that it has its roots in a long history of colonization. The story is long, and tired soldier remembers the opening line of a bedtime story that his father used to tell him. On the dawn of Tuesday, 26th of May, 1908, when the dormant ghosts of oil were awakened by William Darcy's team of engineers and geologists, the story started. They had come from a far, far island, and they found the oil in Masjid Suleiman near Abaddon, near Ostarling. From then on, the curse of oil never left us. The tired soldier still remembers the smell of oil on his father's rough big hands. So I leave the tired soldier in the church's room of Technical Institute for now, and I'd like to finish the presentation by referring to the book Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture by Ellen Frischot, who invites us to turn around an object-oriented and frontal approach to architecture that is carefully framed and curated, and instead to allow its facilitative background to emerge and make architecture near indistinguishable from these surroundings. So the way I experiment with Abaddon Technical Institute and through watching the photograph, as I show in this very short experiment and the work in progress actually, is to assist the background of Technical Institute to take over the building and thereby to invite all these smaller jokes and stories that are circulated among people, local people, to make the building disappear and then reappear differently, and thereby build a different environment world of architecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sepideh. Okay, so now we're looking for Simon Henley.
Hi, David.
Hi, Simon. Simon Henley studied at the University of Liverpool, where he was awarded the Riley Medal in 1992, and also at the University of Oregon. I wonder what he thinks about what's going on in Oregon right now. And one summer he drove 13,500 miles. Is that true? 13,500 miles in search of great architecture. And in fact, you will see with the image that you see on the screen that there is something of Louis Kahn in his thinking. He combines practice with teaching, writing, and research, and is the author of The Architecture of Parking, which I'm going to have to look up, especially because it won an International Book Award from RIBA. Also Redefining Brutalism. And he also writes the Beyond London column for Arch Daily. He's a teacher in the MArch unit at Kingston University, where he has also recently embarked on a PhD by practice, which I think is going to be a part of his talk today. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and also of the Academy of Urbanism, and also of the Brother of Art Workers Guild, which I've never heard of. That sounds really cool. And in 2013, he took a sabbatical to join the Portland, Oregon to Portland Place ride and cycled from Chicago to New York. So that's pretty impressive. So Simon is a traveler, he's a researcher, he's an architect, and I'm very pleased to give him the floor now to give his presentation. Simon, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Is that good? Yes, thank you for that very thorough, probably, introduction. So I'm going to give a paper entitled Facade Studies. And it is, it's combining my practice with my PhD and teaching and so on. The nature of the wall or the envelope has changed radically in the last 50 years. In the past, the construction of buildings have been governed or at least influenced by available materials. The planned forms of buildings were dictated by available technologies, by the capacity of material to bear load and to span and therefore shape and define space. Furthermore, that causality was transposed to the face of the building, wherein ideas about shelter were perceptible. Despite technological change, a similar causality remained evident, and the type of building and type of facade in ways remained connected. Following Buckminster Fuller's 1968 Manhattan Project, the intensification of concern for the environment, and more specifically for performance, means the wall in its new guise is different. Today, it's a complex configuration divided into abstract and imperceptible technical systems. The fabric is not matter as such, but a series of lines that perform discrete technological roles. The reasoning that underpins these abstract elements has been separated from the sensible and perceptible aspects of building. Materials are not being used appropriately. As a result, the perceptible, which had previously served an approximate role that had been observed to work over time and historically had given rise to construction, is lost. So this paper is in 3 parts. The first sets out the origins of our practice and offers an account of a number of facade studies. Next, facades of other architects, and finally, the work we've undertaken with our postgraduate students at the Kingston School of Art. Practice, research, and teaching is also one of construction, reflection, and discussion. In practice, our concern for the facade began with the adaptation of buildings. A new building offers a multitude of possibilities, whereas adaptation asks of the architect what might be different. Talkback is a critique of its original facades. Of course, the facades worked in as much as they let in light and air and supported the floors, but created a barrier between inside and out. Here, the cloistered plan relates to the process of research and production of television programs. The office and the idea of work is associated not with the interior, but with the captured landscape in which the liminal spaces of brick wall and cloister alley are the prime generators of experience. The facade is inhabited and sociable and orientates the inhabitant to their association, perception, and encounters with the garden. Over the next decade, whilst type and plan were essential to the work, we continue to explore the potential of a building's perimeter, developing the idea of a brim, much like that of a hat, first for our unbuilt Lechworth Town Hall competition scheme, and subsequently for an art centre in Goole. Lechworth Town Hall envisages a council chamber and committee rooms surrounded by a brim, affording those outside shelter and at the same time the opportunity of proximity to an open window, to hear discussion and debate and so to be closer to the democratic process. However, Chadwick Hall marks a shift in emphasis to the generative potential of the facade. Although the plan provides a modicum of social structure, by contrast to civic buildings, schools and places of work, housing, in this case student housing, doesn't involve substantive congregation space and the collective experience that affords. The master plan took pre-existing landscape features and used these to compose associations between buildings and their inhabitants. Both plan types and construction take their cue from the dual histories of the nearby 18th century villas and the 20th century blocks on the LCC's Alton West estate. The wall from the former and the frame from the latter. The work encases conventional concrete structures inside low-bearing walls of brick piers and concrete beams. Interiors are wrapped in heavy ruins that orientate each student to the landscape. The ruins mediate between the private realm of the room and the common ground of the garden. The facade plays down the performative aspects of the enclosure and instead heightens the primitive and perceptual dimension of human experience. The wall becomes 2 walls, one technical, the other perceptible, the former encased by the latter. The brick piers with their arrowhead plan transvert and spatialize the wall. Construction realizes a third condition between interior and garden, in effect another building that frames another space. By contrast to congregation space and the collective experience that affords, this construction offers those who dwell in these rooms common experience, an isolated experience, but one that is repeated in the construction of the perimeter walls and spaces that are common to all. Construction gives rise to forms of inhabitation, perception, and social experience, and through that, empathy. The three villas at Frampton Arms couple brick facades and cellular interiors with exposed precast concrete frames. The street facade is brick and comparable to the 19th century facades opposite, whereas the frames are directed at and associated with the open spaces on the post-war estate. Thresholds make sense of their contexts. The frames that wrap around the brick walls of the Littleton Palazzo, as we might call it, but vary in depth due to their aspect to quiet and busy thoroughfares. Once again, the performative and perceptible layers of the wall are divided between internal and external structures. Building acknowledges the realities of construction, bears weight, and so makes some sense, and has to do with weather, shelter, and its immediate urban context. The second phase of King's Crescent again explores the potential of the loggia, but this time as an in situ structure. This more economic approach creates absolute parity between the in situ concrete frame within the building and the visible loggia outside. The facade or wall will be constructed in two halves, one on the internal frame, the other on the external frame. Where there would once have been a single load-bearing wall, it is split into two non-structural parts, one either side of the thermal line. The internal linings and performative layers of the facade are aligned with the internal frame, whereas the brickwork that we associate with a wall bears on the concrete floor of the loggia and belongs with the external frame, not the building per se. The last of these studies is Hackney New Primary School. Its street elevation is constructed with a plinth as a bench. Much like the unfurled perimeter of a chapter house, this south-facing wall serves the casual encounters of parents at each end of the school day. Inside, the school's courtyard walls are sheltered by canopies. Beneath, there are various apertures and seats cut into the inside and outside of the thick wall. The seats in the courtyard and bench on the street embed social patterns in the architecture of walls and thresholds. As the sociologist Eric Klinenberg writes, schools are organizations, but they're also social infrastructures. These facade studies stem first from adaptation, where the world outside was arguably of more interest than that inside. It's led us to rethink the thresholds of buildings. The technique would superimpose a plausible typological reading that was dependent on the reciprocal connection between building and landscape. But any typological rereading was only possible with adjustments to the wall and the liminal space within and immediately beyond the wall. With talkback, the outside space could only be understood to be a cloister due to changes to the facade, and what followed was to continue to explore the reciprocity between facade and type. Turning to the work of others, a building that reconciles performance and culture in construction is Johann Selsing's Orsted Church. The cubic building is founded directly on a rock outcrop and constructed from diaphragm walls of load-bearing brickwork. The interior of the church is a square room. The part of the wall that one can reach and touch is glazed brickwork that thickens at the base to form a bench. Above this, the brickwork is rough and coated with lime wash. At eye level, there is just one window in this space. The glass is set on the outside of the wall, revealing the meter-deep construction required for structural stability and the amount of air for thermal insulation. Selsing manages to construct the building in such a way that it performs, but that it also communicates approximately what it means to shelter the congregation with brickwork and air. Standing in the space with Selsing, he spoke of this as a form of kindness. By comparison to the weight of Selsing Church, Ted Cullen's early houses are light. Designed between 1959 and 63, they illustrate the part played by the perimeter threshold in the development of his architectural language. The third in the trilogy, Camden Mews, is planned at right angles to the street, not beholden to the city and any decorum that demands. Instead, it points towards the sun with its back to the cold northeast winds. This long, thin house with just one facade has been abstracted from its urban situation and intimately associated with the elements. It is as if to build was to draw a line between inside and outside, so that a single facade could draw our attention to nature. Gasson, Meunier, and Andresson's Burquel collection does something similar to Cullinan's early houses. Gasson's montage, a polyptych of a woodland setting, represents a museum interior on the edge of a wood. And although the screen doesn't enfold space in the way that heavy masonry construction might, it adopts the space outside, inside, and conceives of the inside itself as a canopy, much like the wood outside. The fabric of the woodland becomes the substance of the architecture. Today, the design of the Burquel is prescient because, like Cullinan's houses, it reminds us how architecture directs us to the natural world, as opposed to simply demarcating synthetic, tempered spaces set apart from it. In the last academic year, we directed our M-Art studio at the Kingston School of Art to the facade, what we termed the useless facade, invited students to explore the generative potential of the facade. Their research led to some healthy confusion about the nature of facade. For example, Gary's house depends on the dialogue between the carcass of the original house and the carapace of the 1970s one, and the spaces between. Cairns Institute, Gillespie Kidden Coy, St Bride's Church, Stirling's Flory, Piano and Rogers Pompidou, just to name a few, all disaggregate the facade and spatialize its properties. And Lacatan and Vasal's use of the proprietary greenhouse results in an architecture of interstices. And all these precedent studies, Utsen's windowless windows, facilitated by loges at Conly and Confelice, most successfully bind inside and outside, culture and nature. The useless facade studio prompted a response to climate and weather I had not previously observed in student work. However, our ambition for the students to test the generative potential of facade was ultimately not so successful. So this year, we're going to approach the subject from the perspective of the more elementary agricultural building. So this paper is a work in progress, perhaps more hypothesis than thesis, and so may not offer conclusions. Nevertheless, in terms of construction, much of our work and that of others cited in this paper, once again seeks to be perceptible, appropriate, and approximate instead of performative, technocratic, and laminar. The work perhaps demonstrates that it's possible to understand a wall or facade. We comprehend it due to its construction, to its potential for inhabitation, its capacity to orientate the inhabitant to the outside world and to the elements, and so to demystify the environment. The facade's capacity to expose each of us to natural phenomena, consciousness breeds conscience, is in complete opposition to the prevailing technocratic response to the environment and the amoral citizen consumer of buildings and space. Finally, the liminal properties of a wall may translate the facade into a form of social infrastructure. The wall will continue to be a conundrum, but to focus on the facade is liminality and generative potential in the design of buildings, type, construction, inhabitation, orientation to the natural world, and role as social infrastructure reactivates the ethics of both wall and building. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I propose that people open their microphones to applaud Simon. Now, Simon, you have to relinquish control of there we go. Okay, so I'm here. I'm saying thank you to all three participants. I just have to say, wow, because these are really great proposals, presentations. Thank you to all three of you. I won't wait long before opening the dialogue to the floor. I just want to say three key words that seem to me come out of the three presentations. For Harold, Benoît, and Benoît, I'm intrigued by this idea of distributed artifacts. I think there may be some relationships with distributed intelligence. This may be something to talk about in terms of media and how media function. With Sepideh, I'm very intrigued by this idea of watching photographs because we actually did that during your presentation. We were watching the photographs because you were making this presentation, and so we were watching the photographs. But I still want to hear your comments on what it means to watch a photograph. And for Simon, I think something that you didn't mention much, but in your fascinating works, there's this idea of thickness, the thickness of the threshold, the thickness of the wall, of the wall as a threshold. There's something that seems important to me in that respect. So those are just my three kind of keywords for the three of you. But I think if there are other people who want to ask questions already, I think it's good that they ask those questions. And if nobody shows themselves, then I'll ask you to comment on those keywords. But thank you very much to all three. I think it was a fantastic session. I feel very nourished. I don't even have to eat dinner now because I have already enough calories, intellectual calories, to feed myself for the evening.
David, do you mind me? I lost you right in the middle of when you were talking about my talk. I missed what you said.
Oh, sorry.
No, there was a reception here, I guess, where I am.
Well, okay. Just to say, so to repeat the three keywords for Harold, the idea of distributed intelligence as compared to distributed artifacts. For you, for Simon, the idea of thickness, because it seems pretty fundamental to what you're talking about with respect to the wall, and also in the work of your firm, which by the way, seems really interesting to me. And for Sepideh, the idea of watching photos, which I thought was really cool. Okay, so now let's open the floor to other commentators. I see Benoît is here also. Hello, Benoît. Does anybody want to ask a question or to open the discussion?
Can I, David, can I ask a question?
No, you can't. You're an organizer. You're not allowed to ask questions. You're an organizer.
That's a joke, I hope. I have a question for Simon, actually, because the last session we had, I would say, Pauline with her presentation, sort of working from the reality, and it seems to me that Simon is also very much working from the reality of building. And what intrigues me is that if you relate this to this idea of thickness, you would think that the realities of the construction in your case would actually, well, work towards a very economical way of using the wall and not making it extra thick. So is that for you, the reality is that it's sort of a provocation, maybe a reality as a provocation, as a tool to make the wall extra thick?
You mean there's a lack of economy in that?
Well, I would seem, yes, that you put a lot of effort on it. So it might be, is that something that feeds you?
Well, I think that there's in the depth of the wall lies much of the experience of the building. I think maybe it's also, it's about the elementary, ideally it's about the elementary use of material. And so therefore maybe the thickness is not absolutely critical, because that's interesting, say, for example, with the Burrell, where the glass screen co-opts the landscape to become the building, in a sense. So maybe thickness is not everything, but there is, I think, there's questions of kind of, writing this paper for me was one of a bit of a revelation, just about the way of thinking seems to have stemmed from not just finding ourselves building new buildings, but spending time working with older buildings or existing buildings, things that existed, and not starting from with an open with nothing, but actually starting with something, and then asking the question immediately, what should it be, or what else should it be? And so maybe that in itself becomes a process of thickening, as it were. And so one starts to get drawn to doing these things without necessarily realizing what one's doing, i.e. there's an element of intuition. And then appreciating the potential that it has, as it were, literally, if it's, even if just as an aperture for light, we have far greater capacity to animate light from outside to inside if we pass it through something that has depth, and that's something that is intermittently opened up in depth, as opposed to something which is just well, there's absolutely no definition to the light whatsoever, i.e. that everything can pass through it. So there are kind of there are phenomenological reasons why one's drawn to these things, as opposed to, but there's also sort of social. I think there's social reasons. I mean, I'm drawn to the perimeter of buildings, and or I'm drawn to this question of how important it is that people are drawn to the perimeter of buildings, and there again, something which is thin and smooth and flat is not something that draws people to it. So there's lots of reasons why I guess thickness makes sense, and I could go on, so I probably should stop.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
There is this question of thickness, which I've treated also sometimes in my teaching, which is this movement in the beginning of modernism to reduce the wall to a single line. And then the opposite tendency, or the opposite trend, which you see notably with Louis Kahn, to thicken, to make the wall more than just a single line. So I think, well, it's really very interesting to me, but and I appreciate your talk. But now I'll leave the floor to other people to ask other questions or to raise other issues. I see that my hair is behaving very strangely in this video, but well, that's life.
I think it's actually quite striking to me that Sepideh and Simon, they're both talking about the facade of a building, actually, and they're both talking about a certain appropriation. But and throughout this whole conference, we're talking about how can we inscribe architecture or buildings into architectural culture, and what is actually architectural culture, and which buildings take part of that, and which buildings do not take part of that. So I would be interested to hear from both of you, what for you, Sepideh and Simon, what's actually architectural culture? Is it actually opposite almost what you believe has to be architectural culture? Or maybe not.
It's what did you just say?
I'm wondering, Simon, what to you is architectural culture? You're talking about how to place buildings within architectural culture. To me, that's what you're trying to do. Culture and performance into construction. What is architectural culture to you? Or maybe I can ask you a narrowing question.
I should let Sepideh.
Yeah.
Let's hear from Sepideh first.
I think before saying or responding what architecture culture is, I would say that it's not a fixed thing. It depends on who is talking about it, in which context, and who has the access to a voice to define it. Who is actually the gatekeeper? Now, I think for me, it has to do also with the question of decolonization, because there is a mainstream architecture culture that is mostly defined by the European Western, let's say, culture of architecture. And I'm wondering if should we define it, or should we let other voices come in to this, to this mainstream or dominant culture, architecture culture? So for me, a way of breaking down whatever that thing is to bring in minor voices, things that are out of the discipline of architecture, voices or practices that come from the margin, to reshape the architectural culture in a way. So I would say that it's a changing culture. So it's not fixed. As I said, it's both depends on the context, but also time, and it's performative, I would say.
It's amazing actually how you're actually both using the same terminology and the same tools of the designer or the architect, and you're actually saying completely opposite things. Because about performance, that's exactly what Simon said, but I think what he's talking about is not about his architectural culture as something that is changing, as you define it, Sepideh, but as something which is timeless, untimely, and maybe even archaic. Simon, what do you think?
Well, certainly in a literal sense, the performance of buildings now is actually preventing us from realizing what it is that we should all be doing, as it were. We address the technicalities of building, and that makes it sort of, as I say, kind of amoral. And Tony was talking about earlier the environment, and I mean, I think this is for me. I don't know whether this is necessarily a subject that one wants to dwell on, but actually, it's a very natural way of being comfortable about thinking about the contribution that we can make to the environment, because it literally comes naturally. It becomes evident. It becomes apparent. It's demystified. We, as fast as we try to solve the problem, we obscure the solution. But for the engineers who obviously will be sort of left to solve the problem. And I think as architects, we have, again, this is not really a question of morality, but it's a question of kind of it being palpable and actually hugely important and experiential. So these things, we can quite naturally and easily end up in a let's just say a better place. So performance is doing it, is really working against us as the culture, thinking of culture. So it seems that the question of how to deal with the environment is not a cultural one, but I actually think through the kinds of things that I've been talking about, that actually it becomes a cultural one. It becomes absolutely cultural because it is the way we lead our lives. It's the way we would want to. It's the way I think we want to live, and I think so. I mean, the culture of architecture is evolving. It is evolving, isn't it? And maybe that's an easy answer to your question, but the risk that it is at times it's at risk of being sort of autonomous and visual, overly visual, through the way that it's communicated. And one of the things which I think is deeply problematic, and books are also part of the problem, or rather photographs are part of the problem, and the way that we consume imagery at the moment is deeply problematic. And right now, the fact that we can't travel just exacerbates the problem. But actually getting people to realize they have to go and stand in or next to a building to experience it, to then make a judgment about what it is that might be of importance, let's say. So I guess I would say that the architectural culture has got to be, it's got to be space, and it's got to be you know, got to be present in it to have a really to understand it, because so many buildings are a disappointment, quite literally. They might be intellectually interesting, they might be visually interesting, and that stands for architecture so often, but actually if we're really tough, it isn't, or at least it really thins out the field of what is good architectural culture. Well, perhaps I can just come back to the question of the performance and performativity, which has been mentioned. One of the things about performativity is that, and this goes back to Pauline's presentation, who was citing the pragmatists, the meaning of what I say is what you do. Also, performativity is the idea of the speech act. The first definition of a speech act is someone who declares something to be true, and it becomes true by the fact that he or she declares it to be true. And so this idea of discursive practices in architecture can have to do with the fact that when someone says something to be true, it becomes true. So this idea of the influence of architectural discourse, I receive your message, Simon, that also this direct experience of things, this physical experience of being in presence of things, also for Sepideh, the idea of watching and understanding photos, and also the idea of that Harold and his colleagues presented, which is that sort of putting things together creates a kind of what would I say, a kind of agglomeration of truths which make a kind of collective truth, if that's the right word, to be sharing things between different media. These are things that have what some people would call truth effects. So it becomes effectively truth by virtue of being transmitted through different media, and sometimes many different media or media together. And in architecture, we definitely work with different media, but there's this performative effect, which means that things become true by being communicated in this kind of multimedia. I don't like that term, but through multiple media, things become true through that work. Maybe because we haven't heard from Harold yet, maybe it would be good for him to speak for a moment about this idea of multiple media and how they create a certain kind of truth effect. If that inspires him, or Benoît, because there's two Benoîts involved. Maybe you can both respond to this idea of how multiple media create truth effects.
I don't know. I think what we noticed there with this experiment that we with this publication, and how the layout was seemed to be important, is that there is something happening that is not only in a kind of independence of autonomy or autonomy of the content, but it's also the pieces together that started doing things. And having read part of the article for the presentation and then listening to the two others' presentation, I was looking more precisely, or asking myself when seeing the documents, what the documents would mean in themselves, what they are, or what do they tell, why are they chosen. And then you see that there are some differences in the documents shown. That's very clear. There are some historic pictures. There are some pictures that are coming, you don't know really from where, but they seem to be more amateuristic pictures. And then you have professional architecture pictures. And what they tell is very different. Of course, it was quite striking in the case of Simon with the modernist buildings, and well, you have the three moments, and the way they're represented is very different. The images from this practice are very architectural pictures, for example. And I was wondering, what does that tell in itself also? The scale models, they are talking only about the facade, of course, but then you wonder what is behind it, or to what does it relate? It's not really an answer to your question.
No, you're not really answering my question, but that's okay.
Yeah. But anyway, there is indeed, probably there is a kind of, also in the presentations that we make, there is a kind of truth effect that happens through the relations between what we show and what we say. And it's more a question, I think, than I don't know how you can answer that. I don't know if there is a kind of definitive answer to give on that, on, I don't know, maybe how things should happen. But I think it's interesting to interrogate that when you are presenting something, or it's not only in what you say, but also in the choices you make in what you show and how.
Okay. Is there somebody else in the audience who wants to ask a question? Because we have about 10 minutes left. I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
David, can I ask another question?
Oh la la. Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Sepideh, because for an architect to see buildings in ruins, it's always a bit painful. But I suppose if I relate this to the question of Harold, that you want to show something that is in decay. Yeah? It's a power structure in decay, maybe. Oh.
Well, and Simon was mentioning ruins as well, so there.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to keep finding links between three very different stories, I have to say, but so this is my effort. But yeah. So it seems to me that it almost feels like an attack of all the original values of the building, the culture of the building as it was made with this English brick, or I think another building was English brick, but it seems to be not quite indigenous. And then you describe this story of the soldiers and the very dramatic, and then the picture even becomes more dramatic. So you create this reality. I'm just wondering, like, are you speculating about this? Is this a speculative story, or how did you construct this reality, or is it inspired by the image?
Well, I mean,
can you do that?
I think that's what I'm doing. I should probably, because there was no time to explain thoroughly how I'm working with this building. I'm collecting photos of this building in different stages and in different time frames. So that building in the time of war was very intriguing to me, because it's where actually architecture steps back. And also as a colonial monument, suddenly it becomes very vulnerable because of, you know, because of war, because of bombs, because it's not anymore perfect. It's not framed perfectly. So it's collapsing, but it's still, it's standing there. So that's why I started the story and also the act of watching the photographs from that moment. And what I'm working on is that that soldier that is, of course, a character, a fictional character, but at the same time it has reference in the real life, because I mean the building is destructed or semi-destructed because of a real war going on after the revolution, and the revolution is also one of the reasons of revolution goes back to that coup in '53 that was manipulated by MI6 and CIA. So it's actually, I mean, that war-torn status of the building is very important, because it's from there you can go forward to the contemporary moment, to the now. And I have also collected photos of now. The building is renovated now. It's operating, so it's not like that. Again, students are going to that, but now, I mean, other things happening there, like strikes, student movements. So there are photos also of those moments. So this soldier is actually a character who would take us to different moments, you know, bringing us later to now, and then by putting his in relation to his dad and grandfather, he goes back to those moments of colonization and where the British workers were in the city. So, but it's still, for me, that moment of destruction, of destructed building was very very important, because of architecture being rendered vulnerable. So it's a way of, you know, extracting those stories out of a, you know, unstable, vulnerable building.
I think it's nice that you say that you actually, it's a story of fiction, because I mean, in this conference there's also a bit the tendency to say researchers are, you know, these truth seekers that operate with very fixed rules, and then we have the creative architects coming in and enriching research with this. But you, in fact, that is quite a creative act, to invention fictional characters to maybe strengthen your point, or to imagine, to start imagining. So for me, that is actually quite similar. If you talk about tools, these are quite similar tools. They're imaginative and creative tools that work.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
What I found interesting in the question is also that you start from the image, and the question departs from this picture of the demolished building.
Yes.
Then I was wondering, maybe in the two presentations, maybe in mine also, what would happen if you would not have the sound? Yesterday there was a presentation of the master studios at the university, and then the sound went out. So we were seeing the pictures of the teacher, but we could not hear. And if you would depart from the sequence of images that is shown, and you would have to invent the story which is behind what you are showing, it would be probably quite interesting to do this kind of exercise. And it would question quite deeply, what is it that you are showing, probably.
That's very interesting that you mentioned it, because it's another experiment that I'm working with. I mean, this project is part of a bigger project, and I work with storyteller things. So some of the things, buildings or things that they would tell stories in silence. So you watch them, and then they, as you said, it's then the viewer can also imagine that those stories by the actor watching the photographs or watching the still storyteller thing in a way.
But it's also multimedia, and I think maybe, I don't know how it, because I actually you say that there is that there is relations between the text and the images and the drawings, and you describe it as a process of watching, but I would also really describe it as a process of telling, of story. I mean, of that is. You're not only watching the photograph, you're making a story, you're making a storyline, you make them coherent somehow in an imaginative way, which I can imagine that in Harold's combinations of different media, you do the same. You meet, and in the meeting is the creative act or the imaginative act.
Well, I do think that's a question as to when and whether coherence can be created by a combination of different media, because it's not entirely certain as to whether, for instance, a story is mostly linear and it is in principle coherent. As I'm wondering if when we're talking about the context of combinations of different media, whether it can or should be coherent or whether it should be more multivalent. But I see we're arriving beyond the end of our time. I just wanted to say that I very much appreciated Sepideh's phrase of architecture steps back. I really liked that idea. And I really appreciated Simon's presentation for its thickness, and I appreciated Harold's presentation for this idea, which I didn't have time to raise half of the comments that I wanted to make, but one of them is the theater of memory of Giulio Camillo. I think that's something that's very relevant to what you guys were talking about. So all of this is really cool, and we could talk about it for years. But I think now we have to conclude, and then we have to come back for the keynote speaker, Wilfred Wang, at 8 o'clock.